with that, I want to hand over the word to Anna to introduce tonight's event.
Yes, thank you. We are all aware of the importance of forests as an ecosystem and in their role in mitigating climate change. However, many of us know a lot less about international forest and conservation policy and the international treaties on forest conservation. What is the relationship between international forest policies and local practices? And what's the current status of international forest conservation? And what will the future look like, of course? Dr. Bas Arts will join us to answer these and other questions. As a personal professor in forest governance at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen University, he is, of course, an expert on this subject. So I'll leave the rest up to him to talk about it. And at the end of the lecture, there will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions if you have any. You can send them in the chat or you can raise your hands. But we'll discuss that when the lecture is finished. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I'll start by sharing the screen. I hope this will work. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Well, I don't need to introduce myself. Anna already did. Maybe a few words about my background. So I studied biology in Nijmegen, which is natural sciences, but I hold a PhD in public administration, something completely different. Because during my studies, I thought, hey, talking about conservation, of course, it needs to be done on the ground by practitioners, but policy and politics, they set the rules by which conservation can be regulated. So it's also important to study public policy and politics. And that's how I came into this area of international forest policy since the early 90s. And I'll say a bit more about the early 90s later, because I give a short overview of international forest policy later on. And since 2006, I'm affiliated to Wageningen University. First as a full professor and now as a personal professor, which is a Dutch kind of position. But then you are, lucky me, without management. It's just about content and doing science and research. And besides that, I am affiliated to the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency for the Dutch, the PBL, Planbureau voor de Leefomgeving. And there I am the chief scientist. So I'm responsible for quality management of research. So on methodology, technologies, particularly also modeling. So that's my background in short and my current affiliations. Good, talking about forest. This is a global map of forest where you can find forest. Of course, yeah, it's not very detailed, but you get an impression. So the blue, the light green, and the dark green. And then we talk about the boreal, temperate, and tropical forest, respectively. And in total, we are talking about 4 billion hectares of forest, which is about 1/3 of the global land area is forest. Well, the main issue on the basis of which we have international forest policy today is deforestation. And there are 3 main hotspots of deforestation. And I guess you know that this is often in the press. It's in Latin America, particularly the Amazon region, of course, Brazil, but also Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and other countries. The central part of Africa, particularly the Congo Basin, and then in Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, but also Australia. And Australia is a specific case. You also probably know that from the media last year. It's particularly about forest fires, also related to climate change. But luckily, we also have hotspots of forest expansion. So it's not only forest loss, which we observe today. And particularly China is one of the champions in terms of forest expansion. I don't know exactly, but it's about 1 million of hectares a year which are planted in China. Yes, particularly plantations, but also the United States of America and less so Canada. You see forest expansion. And if you then look at, let's say, the data of the last couple of decades, you see here in red the degree of deforestation from minus 16 million hectares a year in the decade 90-2000, up to minus 10 currently, more or less. So what you also see is that the rate of deforestation is reducing, which is maybe good news, but we are still confronted with a net forest loss today. But you also see that we have this forest expansion, which was highest in the 2000s and a bit lower today. But the net forest change is about minus 5 million hectares today. And that's a bit more than the Netherlands in terms of area. And it's more or less a country like Costa Rica every year. I have to say that these kind of figures are disputed. This is from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And they base their figures on a country reports. So every country in the world, they deliver a report to FAO, and on the basis of that, they have these aggregated data. But you also have researchers which use their own GIS technologies, and they find different figures. But okay, I leave it here. You get an impression of what the situation is today, and FAO figures are generally used by many. Okay, this also shows that the rate of deforestation is reducing over time. So -8 in the 90s, and now -5 more or less in the 2010s. And for some people, this is good news. And some people also claim, yes, many policies are effective. I'll come back to the question of effectiveness later. But if particularly environmental organizations are still very disappointed about these figures, because we know about deforestation for decades, and we are still not able to really stop it. Okay, where does forest expansion come from? And there are 3 sources. Of course, plantations. You can plant forests. If you manage it well, the forest will regrow. You have reforestation after logging. That's the left down picture. But you also have a lot of natural regeneration, and particularly in abandoned land where once was agriculture. Often spontaneously, forest will grow. So these are the 3 sources of forest expansion. If you then look at the drivers of forest loss, and again, I guess you have read about it, it's particularly agriculture, large-scale agriculture. So the soya, but also the cattle, but also small-scale agriculture. So agriculture done by forest-dependent people, smaller communities. Logging, high quality timber from the tropics is of course used widely globally, and you have all kind of other interventions like mining and roads and urbanization. And if you then look at the key drivers, then it's particularly large scale commercial agriculture. About 60% of all deforestation is directly related to commercial large-scale agriculture. It's 20% for small scale, 10% for logging, and about 10% for all the others, including then mining. It's important to add here that this differs a lot for each continent. So if you look at Africa or Latin America or Asia, you'll find very different figures on this. Well, partly these things happen just legally. It's allowed, and people have a permit, or companies have a permit to log, to deforest for agriculture, etc. But a huge part is also illegal. And I'll show some figures later. And this is maybe even a bigger problem, that particularly in the remote areas of the tropics, you'll find a lot of illegal practices from all these sources, from all these drivers. You can, of course, ask yourself, is this a problem, deforestation? You can also say it also contributes to economic development, right? So agriculture is a good thing, timber is a good thing. So why is it such a big issue on international agendas? So here are 4 reasons why deforestation is such an important topic in the media, in politics, in policymaking. So the first one is livelihoods. It's estimated that about 1.5 billion people in the world are directly related to forests for their local livelihoods. And then you can think about food and fodder, about fuel wood. You can think about bush meat, all kind of products and services which people get from the forest and which they also need directly for their survival. 1.5 billion, and that's of course a lot of people. If you look at timber, it's a valuable resource. It's maybe a global market of $215 billion a year, which is a lot. And if you produce it sustainably, then it's ongoing source. But there's also a lot of mining, so cut and run as a way of as a way of doing forestry. So the valuable timber is being exhausted today in many places of the world. Then biodiversity. As I said, about 1/3 of the land is covered by forest, but it gives home to about 80% of the biodiversity on land. So it's an important source of biodiversity. And finally, climate change. So Anna, in her introduction, already referred to climate change related to forest. And it's estimated that about 15 to 20% of the global warming problem, so global warming, which is induced by human intervention, so not a natural trend. So about 50 to 20% of that problem is related to deforestation, forest degradation, and conventional logging. So if forests were conserved and they were really sustainably used, then the whole climate change problem would about 20% less. Okay, so I sketched the issue, I sketched the problem, and now I will say a few words about the responses to deforestation and forest degradation. And this particularly started in the 70s. So there was a big international outcry about tropical deforestation from all kinds of sources, and particularly environmental organizations were at that time very active to put this on agendas nationally, internationally. And also the first initiatives were taken to try to counter it. If you look at the international level, then the first milestone was in 1983, the International Tropical Timber Agreement. This is an agreement among tropical timber exporting and timber importing countries, including the Netherlands. And this agreement is particularly on trade, to make the international trade purely based on legal timber, so to avoid these illegal practices of logging, but also to have more sustainable use of forest. This is the 2 objectives of that agreement. The second response was in 1985 by the FAO. I already referred to that organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And this started the Tropical Forestry Action Plan in 1985 because the ITA, so that agreement is on trade. This action plan is much more on forest management at national and local level, how to improve the management, how to avoid deforestation. This plan was to some extent effective. Every year about $1 billion were invested in that plan. At the same time, it was a plan, a program. It was not legally binding. So people, countries, organizations were free to work with it or not to work with it. So what the international community tried was to have an international legally binding treaty where all forest issues were dealt with and policies were agreed upon as an umbrella agreement for the whole world, on the basis of which countries could develop and design national policies. But that treaty failed. Too many clashes of interest among rich and poor countries, among groups who wanted to go for, on the one hand, forestry or more conservation of forest. So diplomats, negotiators were not able to agree upon a treaty. And it was, at least according to environmental organizations, a bad thing, because in '92, there was a big global conference in Rio de Janeiro, the so-called UNCED, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And the idea was that the treaty, which was negotiated in the 80s, that it would have been finalized and signed at this Rio conference in '92. But the treaty failed. And what they then decided is to adopt a number of non-legally binding forest principles. And these principles are all related to sustainable forest management. And I guess you have heard about sustainable development. And that's a way of developing your economy by which also ecological dimension and the social dimension are balanced. So people, profit, planet, and these kind of expressions. And as said, you might have heard about that. And also forests can be organized, particularly then forest economics, in a way that it also balances out with ecological and social dimensions. But of course, this is all conceptual and nice talk, but how to implement it. So therefore, after UNCED, there came a new United Nations body, which is the UNFF, the United Nations Forum on Forest. And this body was meant to execute and implement these forest principles. And again, they tried to have an legally binding international treaty on forest. And again, in the 2000s, it failed for similar reasons. Too many opposing interests among countries in the world. And then they adopted, not forest principles, maybe a step forward, they adopted, and here is the acronym, a non-legally binding instrument, an NLBI, on all types of forest. And if you read it, it's a sort of international treaty with the difference that it's not legally binding. So it's just voluntary commitments of countries to follow up on the rules in that treaty. And the rules are all based on this sustainable forest management. So to improve forest management globally and to avoid deforestation and forest degradation. So then we arrive at the final thing, which is quite recent, 2017. There was a lot of critique on the United Forum on Forest and on this non-legally binding instruments, that it was not very effective. And then they decided to have a new try at the UN level. And now we have the UN SPF, which is the United Nations Strategic Plan on Forest. So they have now a strategic plan as a follow-up on this non-legally binding instrument, and 6 global forest goals. So that's what we have today in terms of international forest policy. And these 6 global forest goals are key. I go through them one by one, but quickly. So here they are. The first one is to reverse forest cover loss. Actually, this is about stopping, halting deforestation. The second one is to improve forest benefits and livelihoods. So I already explained to you that about 1.5 billion people around the world are dependent on forest. So they should also in the future be able to have their needs fulfilled through the forest products and services. Then the third goal is about protecting the forest and use the products sustainably. Again, this relates to sustainable forest management. The fourth goal is to have sufficient resources to implement all these goals, which is always an issue at the international level. We have many beautiful treaties, but often we lack the resources, or countries are not really willing to mobilize the resources to implement them. So we have paper, but we don't have many practices. The fifth one is about inclusive forest governance. So inclusive meaning that both developing and developed countries have equal say in these forest governance initiatives. And finally, that different sectors should work together. For example, water management, forest management, agriculture, these sectors, they should work together to improve forest management around the world. So these are the 6 global forest goals, and they are sort of umbrella framework for the world to work on improving forest conditions. Okay, I'm quite sure that you won't understand this figure, but that's not a big problem. The only thing I want to show to you here, and this figure is from a recent publication, that forest policy is more than what I just explained to you. What I just explained to you are so-called forest-specific policy, and then we are actually talking about these 6 goals. But we also have forest-related policies, and often then you do talk about legally binding treaties. And you can, for example, think about biodiversity, about trade, about sustainable development, about climate, about human rights. And on all these issues, we do have international legally binding treaties. And forests are part of these treaties as well. So if you think about international forest policy, you have those to take into account as well. And the authors of this paper have been counting, and they counted 41 international forest policy programs. And some are forest specific, some others are forest related. Again, a figure you won't understand, but that's not the point. The point I want to make is that some authors have tried to make and to categorize these 41 policies in a more to have an overview of what we do find, and I'll summarize what they do. So they find 6 types of forest policies. The first one is international law. And as I said, there is no international legally binding forest treaty, but we have many other treaties that relate to forest. The first one, the CBD, is about biodiversity. It's an international convention on biological diversity, and it includes a forest program. Then you have the UNFCCC, which is the International Treaty on Climate Change. And this one most people know, and it also includes a mechanism of forest, which is REDD+. Sorry for all the acronyms, but this is part of that world and the world of international diplomacy. But REDD+ is a program on forest conservation to reduce the emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So this is all focusing on avoiding climate change through better forest management, through better forest conservation. And that's called REDD+, but you can forget about this acronym. But this program is legally binding because it's part of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is part of this UNFCCC. So that's a complex of international regulation on climate change. Type 2 are the so-called non-legally binding instruments. You have seen that acronym, and you talk about, for example, the forest principles from '92, this UN strategic plan of forest, and these global forest goals. Again, non-legally binding. These are, so to speak, moral commitments. Then there is type 3, which is called hybrid regimes, and it's called hybrid because it's a combination of national and international policy, and of governments on the one hand and non-governmental actors on the other. And what do I mean with non-governmental actors? You can think of companies or associations of companies, and these are also active in international diplomacy, particularly big corporations like Shell or other oil companies. They have their associations who are also active in international diplomacy. But you can also think of NGOs like WWF or IUCN. They are very active. They lobby in international arenas where diplomacy takes part. Here you have 2 other acronyms, but I come back to those 2 in a minute because I also want to show some more case studies to you. Then you have type 4, public-private partnerships. And these are partnerships among, again, governments and non-governmental organizations. But this is on the international level. They are a bit different from hybrid regimes. Hybrid regimes also include binding obligations. So they are not just voluntary, while these public-private partnerships, that's voluntary. So companies and governments are free to become part of it or not to become part of it, and also free to step out. And a very famous one is the Bonn Challenge, which is, I think, a few years old and which was agreed upon in Bonn, but it's on forest restoration. So the international community decided, together with private private actors, particularly companies, to restore 300 million hectares of degraded forest in 2030. So in the next 10 years, 300 million hectares, which is quite a lot. And that's the commitment of a huge number of partners in that partnership, the Bond Challenge. Then type 5 is private regulation. It's regulation initiated by private, sometimes companies or NGOs or together. But these regulations are binding upon the associates in for example, an industry association. So it's decided at that level, but if you're a member of that association, you are bound to the rules. So it's binding and private at the same time. And then you have type 6, which is private and non-binding. And these are forms of self-regulation, and which has become very popular, let's say the last 5 years, is these so-called zero deforestation commitments. And these are adopted by individual companies, which want to make sure that their production process will not come along with deforestation. And you can think about cattle ranching in the Amazon, you can think about soya production, but also leather production, because leather is related to cattle. For example, Gucci from Italy, this famous company, they don't want to have leather which is related to deforestation. So zero deforestation commitments. And again, this is a form of self-regulation, because there's no government who says to Gucci and other companies that they have to do it, but they want to do it because they want to show to their consumers that they take care for forest. So these are the 6 types of international forest policies which you might find. So it's quite a complex set of rules and initiatives. Okay, let me go into more specific examples in the last part of the lecture. So FLAG-T, PFM, FSC, PFC, all acronyms, but I'll make it clear what it is. PFM is Participatory Forest Management. Now, Participatory Forest Management is also developed by the FAO already in the 80s, related to their tropical forest action plans. But the idea is that if you manage a forest, and often this is done by state forest departments, it's very important that the people who live in those forests or close to those forests also have a say in decision making about forest management. And actually you are talking about forest management by and with local communities and indigenous people. And this might sound not very, maybe not as a very big initiative, but it is. But because if you look at the size of it, today we are talking about 600 million hectares, which is managed and or owned by local communities and indigenous people. And they manage their forests differently than before. Overall better, so that the forest condition improves, but also that their livelihoods improve, which are dependent on those forests. Second one is forest certification. And maybe some of you have seen the right one, which is FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council. So if you buy timber or some products in the shop, also in the Netherlands, sometimes you find this FSC label. And this FSC label guarantees that the timber and the product thereof, and that timber is from sustainably sourced trees and forest. So if you are a forest owner, either in the Netherlands or in Brazil, whatever, and you manage your forest in a sustainable way, you can go for a certificate. You can become certified by FSC or PEFC. These are the 2 main big programs in the world. So that you can show to your traders, to your consumers, that you manage your forest in a responsible way. Of course, both PEFC and FSC have their own requirements. So if you want to become certified, you have to make sure that you live up to their standards, live up to the principles and criteria. This all started in early 90s, which for me is not very long ago. I guess for you it's a bit longer ago, but I started my academic career in the 90s, so I could follow how this happened. And this happened with only a forest in Mexico of 90,000 hectares. But today, if we look at the PF, 320 million hectares worldwide, and FSC is 220 million hectares worldwide. So together, 540. And this is only in 30 years' time. I think that's quite impressive. And I come back to the quality of those initiatives in a minute, whether it makes a difference in terms of forest management. And then the third example, which is also the last one, is about illegal logging and the legalization of timber trade. And this is a big thing still today, and it's estimated, and it's very difficult because it's actually about forest crime, which is a dark world. So we don't have many data about it, or you have to go undercover and do the things they do. But it's estimated about 30% of international timber trade is based on illegal sources. So this timber is cut and logged against the national laws of that specific country. And if you look at individual countries, and we have done work in Ghana, for example, about 70% of all the logging in Ghana is against their own law. So it's illegal. And people are aware of this, and the European Union as well. So the European Union started what they call the FLAG-T initiative, VPA initiative. And FLAG-T stands for Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade. Again, a complex acronym. And VPA stands for a Voluntary Partnership Agreement. So what the EU does is try to have as many of these agreements with tropical timber exporting countries to make sure that they take initiatives that all the timber which comes from that country is based on legal sources, so that we as the European Union only import legally sourced timber. And today probably is still 30% illegal. Again, an estimation. So, and of course, the EU pays exporting countries to implement these kind of systems. And these systems are about a legality standard, about a wood tracking system, so a traceability system. And today we do have very, very refined systems that you go from the timber you see in your room back to the stem in the forest where it was cut. You have these, you can work with these, how is it called? These things which you also find on products. This is also used in tracing timber. And then you can also have a licensing scheme, like the FSC is a license. If you see FSC on a product, you know as a consumer, hey, this is from a sustainably managed forest. And they are now developing similar kind of systems for legal wood, so that you as a consumer or trader recognize, hey, this is legal timber. But of course, the EU also has to do something, and the Netherlands as well, because we are a member of the EU. So the EU has the EUTR, which stands for the European Union Timber Regulation. And this timber regulation asks all companies, all traders, all wood processors, that they themselves take care that the timber they import is from legal sources. And of course, in the future, if all countries have these licensing schemes, you will recognize it as a trader. Hey, this is from legal sources. But that is still in development. And already today, all companies have to make a risk assessment whether they import legal or illegal timber. And once there is a risk of illegal timber, they cannot do it. And if they do it, there are sanctions. They can be fined. And the fines can be quite something. So through this initiative, the EU tries to avoid any import of illegal timber in its markets. Okay, go to a final table before I go to the conclusions to say something about the area covered by these initiatives. But we did also some studies on effectiveness. And I say we as a university group, but we also make use of studies of colleagues. And we did some systematic literature reviews on the performance of these initiatives. And then we look at environmental performance, but also social economic performance. to get an impression whether they are effective or not. If you look at this FLAG-T initiative of the European Union, in terms of size, if it's fully implemented, it will be more than 400 million hectares if we take together all these VPA countries. And today it includes Ghana, Vietnam, Indonesia, Honduras, Democratic Republic of Congo, 15 countries in total, and their forests jointly amount to 400 million hectares. But although it was initiated 15 years ago, we don't have data yet on performance. It's too early. The implementation is still taking place. And there's only one country in the world which is now exporting FLAG-T licensed timber, and that's Indonesia. Only one country. Okay, let's have a look at forest certification. As said, this is more than 500 million hectares. And if you then look at all kind of impact assessments, which you can find in the literature, then the conclusion is that about half of these assessments report positive environmental impact. And some show more impact, others show less impact, but about half of the initiatives produce positive impact. The same about social economic performance. Actually, there's a lot behind these very simple figures, but I'd lack the time to explain that all to you. The same we did for participatory forest management, which is about 600 million hectares globally. And this initiative is particularly performing in terms of environmental indicators. Then you can think about biodiversity in the forest. You can think about forest condition, including timber quality. And if I say positive impact in these studies, it's always compared with a forest where you don't have that initiative. So a PFM forest compared to a conventional logged forest. And again, about social economic performance, this PFM is about half of the assessment show positive impact. If we take all these areas together, this is to show that, at least is what I think, quite impressive. It's about 1.5 billion hectares, which is more than 30% of all the forests worldwide. So we are really talking about something, although still partly in the process of implementation. Not all interventions have a positive impact, but let's say about half does. To add to that, I didn't talk about forest protection. But this is what's happening besides the programs I'm referring to in this table. But here we're all talking about initiatives to increase the sustainability or the legality of forest management or forest use. So this is really about forest and people, forest and economics, right? But we also have initiatives to get forest protected areas. So that's something which adds up to what's expressed in the table. And today, about 80% of the world's forests are in legally established protected areas. And then we are talking about 700 million hectares, more or less. And when I started my career in the early 90s, this was only 10%. So in, let's say, 25, 30 years, this more or less doubled this area of forest protection. And of course, not all of these protected areas are successful in protecting biodiversity. Some are better than others. But still, it's, again, this is my opinion, impressive growth in a short time. So to conclude, 1/3 of global land is forest today, about 4 billion hectares. And you will find that 80% of terrestrial biodiversity, if you think in terms of livelihoods, about 1.6 billion people around the world are directly dependent on those forests. And the global markets of timber has a value of $215 billion a year. So just to express the importance of forest. So annual net global forest loss is about 5 million hectares, but about 20 years ago, it was more or less double. So what we do see is that the rate of deforestation is reducing over time. Some people say that's good news. Some others say it's going far too slowly. Then we do have, as a response to these problems, many forest-specific instruments and forest-related treaties, in total about 40. And as I tried to explain to you, 6 types of policies. And together, the cases I showed to you, they have a reach of about 2.2 billion hectares, which is more than half of the world's forest. And if you then look at the performance, at the effectiveness of these initiatives, then you can say that about half of these interventions seem to produce a positive outcome for forest and people. And I say seem because in that table I showed to you, that's based on many studies around the world, and they also represent millions of hectares, but still it's very doubtful whether we can already generalize all these findings from the literature to all the forests around the world. And therefore I say it seems about half of the policy interventions seem to produce positive outcomes for forest and people. Of course, it's a bit a glass of water, half full, half empty, and then it depends where you would like to emphasize. And I guess environmental organizations would say, hey, the glass is still empty. Why are things going so slowly? Some other people would say, hey, if you compare the situation today with the one 20 years ago in terms of certified forests, in terms of forest protected areas, et cetera, a lot of things happened. And with that, I come to the end of my presentation. And thank you so much for your attention. And I hand over to Anna, I think.
Yes, thank you very much for your lecture, Dr. Arts. And thank everyone for attending and for being there. Before we go on to ask questions for Dr. Arts, if you have questions, you can either raise your hands under participants or send me a message. I would also like to inform everyone that, of course, one of the reasons we wanted to organize this lecture was because of our charity this year is for forest conservation. So if you, inspired by this lecture, would want to donate a bit to our charity, please go ahead. I will send a link in the chat. And with that, I will move on to the question and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand or send me a message, and then we'll first ask a question which came in through our live stream. From Ramses, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Illegal rosewood trafficking from the Gambia to China has steadily increased despite the tree's endangered status. What kind of policies could be effective at curbing said logging and trafficking?
Yeah, that's indeed. I'm aware of these kind of flows of the illegal timber markets from Africa to China, or from Asia to China, different countries. And unfortunately, there is no regime yet or international policy that's covering that flow of illegal timber. I talked about illegal logging and illegal trade, but this is particularly so among the European Union and some timber exporting countries, not all of them. And they are working on a system to avoid this illegal harvesting and illegal trade. Among Africa and China, there is no such thing as such a regime or a policy to avoid this. So yeah, well, this is actually bad news. The good thing is that Australia has now also started to work on a similar kind of system as the European Union and also the United States. So they are working on similar kind of policies to avoid and even to ban the import of illegal timber. But yeah, it's a very good point. So this is just part of the whole problem, which is maybe covered in the future, but part is not. And therefore, particularly environmental organizations continue to say that we need an international legally binding treaty, which is valid for all countries around the world, including then also dealing with this issue of illegal harvesting and illegal trade. And then on the basis of that international treaty, maybe sanctions or whatever measures could be taken against this flow of illegal timber between Africa and China. But until now, there is no international instrument to counter this development.
I hope this answers your question. Then there's another question here from Anna. So if you would like to post it yourself, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello. Thank you so much for the lecture. I actually had a question regarding the situation within the EU. Because EU has arranged or has set up this mechanism that can basically certify that the timber has been legally procured, and I feel like in a lot of the cases it focuses a lot on timber that comes from outside of the EU, because EU obviously in this whole market is a main importer of timber. But I'm wondering, within the EU, there's also a lot of illegal deforestation. And there's a lot of illegal deforestation that goes unnoticed because the wood is being laundered within the borders of the country. So at the moment that the wood, exits the country, it's basically legal. It's already laundered in the phase of the transport. So it's really, really difficult to basically trace it back unless you go on the ground and see, the permit doesn't correspond with the area that has been deforested. So I'm just wondering, there's EU companies that illegally participate in illegal deforestation within the EU in different countries. But there, or at least maybe in my opinion, there seems to not be so much attention given to this or so much emphasis given to this. And it's kind of this old age rhetoric of, well, other countries do it and we try to prevent it because it's happening in Africa, it's happening in Latin America, it's happening in Southeast Asia, but it's also happening in the Balkans, it's also happening in Eastern Europe, it's happening on very large scale. And there's companies, like really big companies in the EU, let's say IKEA, that, it's not a secret that there has been a lot of debate on have they been involved or not in illegal deforestation. So I'm wondering what could the EU do more in this situation, or how could they refocus within, like basically look at themselves and say, well, it's also happening in our backyard, basically.
Yeah, this is a very good point, and it's also a bit maybe a double morality in the European Union, and it's also very complicated because forest policy and forest law is not an EU competence, and maybe you know that because you showed a lot of expertise and knowledge on illegal logging in Europe. So that makes it difficult to intervene. Actually, on paper, all the countries which are a member of the EU have national forest laws which should prevent these illegal practices. But you're right, it's not happening. Personally, I know a bit from the Balkan. I supervised a student who did research on illegal logging, particularly in Serbia, which is not a member of the EU, but would like to become a member. And also in Bosnia and Croatia is a member. And indeed, there is a lot of illegal logging, particularly also after the war in Yugoslavia. And it's also for her, it was a very dangerous research even because many companies are involved. And you have also Hungary, Romania, other countries. So the EU doesn't have many possibilities to intervene. But indeed, I agree with you that it's quite of a double morality to only look at the tropics and to say that the problems are there. I think more and more it's acknowledged that we do have illegal logging and illegal trade within Europe as well. Also the technologies to track and trace are improving, the genetics. There's a big research project at Wageningen University as well to use genetics to trace illegally logged timber, and you can do that everywhere, including in Europe. So, but that's a bit of a technocratic hope for the future that you can, through these technologies, improve the situation. But that will take another decade before we have these technologies. So, the only thing you can do is to put pressure on the countries at the moment within the current rule system, and NGOs do. I know many environmental NGOs do to get get these illegal logging practices being reduced. But yeah, that's my answer. I guess it's not satisfying, but
yeah. No, I was also thinking if there could be anything done, for example, on the level of companies, right? If that could be an approach, because EU doesn't have competence in terms of forest regulation, but perhaps it could have, find a way to sanction,
Yep.
to limit the activity of certain companies. But yeah, I don't know too much about it, so I was just wondering.
Yeah. No, that would be a good.
Thank you.
Good idea. And I think what I know is, and that I don't know whether you know it, is FERN. It's an organization at the EU level working on forest. And they also have advocated boycotts against companies within Europe, outside Europe, who are involved in illegal practices. So that's of course one way, and to make consumers aware that these things happen. And if you know the name of the companies, you can act upon that as a consumer. But of course, yeah, you need a critical mass of consumers to really change the behavior of a company. But it's true, you're right. That's one of the ways of doing it. Besides that, governments can push other EU members to change to try to change these practices. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Then, if your question is answered, I'll give the word to Matthias, who also has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the lecture, first of all. I thought it was quite interesting, difficult to follow at times, but interesting nonetheless. You, in your answer to Anna, you just said that at Wageningen University, they're developing a method of tracing where certain woods came from by tracking their genetics. I'm wondering to what extent such practice is already being implemented or planned to be implemented, because I know that in wildlife conservation and in animal conservation, they're trying to use similar means, but they're not really implemented yet, and they're not really effective yet. So what are current methods of tracking and impacting illegal logging, illegal forest clearing, and to implement policy, which are used now? And what is, well, the likelihood or the chance of these currently in development methods being implemented in the near future?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. At least what you say about with animals. This is all in an initial phase. So they are researching and they have these pilots in the field. But if you look at crime in general, if you look at these genetic techniques which are used to today, even in court as proof for certain crimes, you may expect that similar things will happen with illegal trade of animals or plants or seeds, and the same also with timber. So I expect within 10 years this will be applied in a much higher level than today. But yeah, it's still in an initial phase. Then I have a question back. What part was so difficult about the lecture? Maybe I'm too much involved to see that myself, but maybe you can help me.
Too many figures which would be too difficult to explain now, and I'm just wondering what that would, what all the details which you wouldn't be able to explain within 40 minutes would entail. Yeah. But that's impossible due to time. Besides that, everything was very clear.
Okay. Yeah, but if you have some feedback, not only you, Matthias, but some others, because to be honest, I'm not used to, I particularly lecture my own students who have some background. So it's good to hear back from another audience what could be better. No problem. Yeah, be welcome.
Thank you. So you say that in 10 years, these will be implemented. What are current means to do so? Do you literally have to use satellite footage, or like what can we use now before those techniques are implemented?
Yeah, what we did most research in Ghana on this system, which is being implemented today, and they wanted to use these barcodes. So you have barcodes on everything, on your log, on your stump in the forest, on your products. So if you have your wooden table in your room, there would be somewhere a barcode, and you can just read it, and then it pops up where it comes from, including the forest and the location and everything. Another way, which is more sophisticated, is indeed through GPS tracking. But what we saw in Ghana, this is technically possible, but practically not so much. So what they are working with today still is with a physical tag. So there is something on the stump in the forest, a tag, and there is a tag on the log, and there's a tag on the product. So there is a way of tracing back, but this is talking about greenwashing or laundering. This is, of course, much more subject to the dangers of laundering. And this is already happening. I refer to this. There's one country who is now exporting this flag tea licensed timber, which is Indonesia. But there's already a trade in the certificates. So there is laundering in this system already, although it started 2 years ago. So today the systems are not sophisticated enough to avoid that. And I think barcodes are a step forward, and later on genetics are probably another step forward. Although you will never have a system without any crime. So I think there's always a criminal layer in whatever society practice or trade or management system. But that's, yeah, might be human nature. Well, maybe not nature, but socialization or whatever, but crime is part of it. But of course you can try to reduce it for the best of people and forest.
It's currently what is the norm, essentially, I'd say. But yeah, okay, thank you for that answer. I hope it will improve in the near future when it comes to Indonesia.
Yeah.
I think those are all the questions I received. I would like to thank you very much for answering the questions and for giving the lecture. It was a great lecture. I really enjoyed it. And I would like to thank everyone who participated.
Okay, thank you and for inviting me. And I really like to prepare it and do it. And great, thanks.
Thank you very much for coming, Dr. Arts.
You're welcome. Okay, so we say goodbye.
If you want to stick around.
Okay. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening. Ciao.